Working Cows Podcast, episode 262. This episode is brought to you by farmingtheweb.ca. Create your first listing today and receive a $15 Tim Hortons gift card.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, powered by the Global Ag Network. Are you looking to quickly and efficiently buy or sell agriculture products or get the word out about your ag event? Avoid the headaches of using non-ag marketplaces or classified sites and check out farmingtheweb.ca, Canada's best free classified site designed by and for Canadian farmers. Create your first listing and receive a $15 Tim Hortons gift card. Buy, sell, get back to work. Get started today and visit farmingtheweb.ca. Very excited to be joined today by Marissa Taylor and James Rogers. They are both from Northway Ranch Services, and they are offering consulting services, monitoring services, bookkeeping services, all kinds of services for ranchers, and just helping them to be freed up to do the things that they do best and the things that they are the best at and the things that they enjoy most, so that they can be freed up to really add value to the business in that way. And so we're going to talk to them about that today on the Working Cows Podcast. So James, welcome back. Marissa, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
Good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
You guys have dove off into a venture, Northway Ranch Services, and kind of just tell me a little bit, I guess, about what facilitated the creation of this business and what kind of the work that you guys are focused on doing.
Well, I'll put Marissa on the spot here. So she, because I really think it was a brainchild of hers from the very beginning. But yeah, we kind of found ourselves connecting through some mutual friends, and we both actually sit on the Western Landowners Alliance board and kind of got to know each other through that. And I was at a transition point in my career, and so I'll let Marissa kind of build a little bit of a story about how we ended up coming together there.
My family ranches in Southwest Wyoming, and my parents own the ranch. My husband and I help run the operations, and my brother came to visit the ranch, and as he was leaving, he doesn't live on the ranch. He said, "You got to get some help. Like there's like a lot going on here with records and all the things you're keeping track of." And he had suggested looking into getting some kind of a administrative support to just help keep everything organized. And so we did that, and it made a tremendous impact on our ranch and the way that we were operating. I think, like looking back, it gave the time and the space for us to create some systems and some accountability outside of our family unit to create those systems and how we were keeping track of whether it's our grazing or our animal treatment records or inventory management, and further refining kind of how we were looking at our economics and our budgeting. And getting those systems together led us to a place where we started asking ourselves better questions about our management. And I think at that point realized that we could really benefit from some outside support and some outside eyes. And James and I were at a meeting for Western Landowners Alliance. And I said, "Hey, I knew he was in a transition. Do you have any interest in helping us look at how we can either further refine the systems that we've created and get some answers and some management, higher level professional management support in the way that we're running this ranch?" And he said, yes.
And so was it a one-off at that point, kind of more of a consulting relationship that grew into, hey, there's probably others out there that are looking for services like this? Is that kind of how it developed?
Yeah, I think it was a bit of a combination. The admins getting support and sort of an outside voice in our ranch made such a big impact on us that I think I talked about it enough that there were other ranchers that had asked, how do I get that kind of support? We've been exploring that idea. As you start to get organized, you do start to ask yourself better questions. And so where is the need in the market or in the ranching community? Is it in admin support? Is it in management support? Is it in a little bit of everywhere? And I think that's where we find ourselves today.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And one of the kind of things that I guess I'll call it a mantra, if I can use that word, of the ranching for profit community is, that we grow up and we learn how to raise cows, how to grow crops, how to, market those things on some level. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we know how to run a business that, raises cows and grows crops and markets those things. So that whole learning how to run that business and learning how to keep the right records and maybe not keep other records is I think a challenge that a lot of people face. And so is that kind of the niche that you guys have, that you originally set out to serve, I guess? Is that kind of the niche that you set out to serve, is help them find out what records to keep and then and keep those records and those kinds of things?
I would say we question ourselves all the time. I mean, one thing that we discuss a lot is that there is a push, and I would say within the ranching for profit community, is this real focus on working, on the business, not in the business, right? And yet what we think about a lot is working in the business is what people really enjoy doing. And we can kind of demean that and call that the, $10 an hour work. And yet what all the while, like a rancher's going and working on his business and trying to do the $100 an hour work, and he can't find anybody to do the $10 an hour work. And really, he's the best guy to do that. And so almost flipping that on its head is a little bit of a discussion that we have. And we wrestle with it a lot. Is it easier to find somebody to actually help you with the $100 an hour work, and you do your $100 an hour work? Because it's really $100 an hour work that's out there on that ranch, moving those cows around, making the observations that are necessary, making sure that the information that's sent back to the office is accurate and timely. That's really valuable work, and we don't demean that work. And actually, a lot of ranchers are the best at it. And so rather than trying to go find a hired guy or a gal to go out there and do your irrigating or to rope and doctor your calves or whatever, and that's really what you enjoy doing, what if we can support that other stuff, some of those systems and some of the analysis, and be, coming alongside that rancher in just as valuable work as what they're doing, and not separating the two and saying, oh, one's better than the other one. They're both valuable. And so, it's a discussion we have, that it's like what the rancher does is really valuable. It's $100 an hour work. I mean, it's really important work that they're doing out there, and you can't find people to come and do that work anymore. And yet we think there's actually maybe more capacity to find some of this other work and outsource that work that you don't have to provide housing on that ranch for, that you don't have to provide, insurance for, that you don't have to provide meals for, or whatever else, right? I mean, it's a discussion we have. So
one of the clients that we worked with didn't have systems in place. Said that when they'd go to do their $100 an hour work, they'd pay themselves $100 an hour to get all of the information together needed to execute the $100 an hour work, and they only had 15 hours, say, to do that budgeted, or only 15 hours in their day. And by the time they got all their information together in order to make those analysis, they were all done. Both financially, they ran out of money to keep paying themselves to do that work, and their time wise, they were done. So there is a bit of work in there and an efficiency in there in maintaining these. Since there's $20 an hour work, $50 an hour work to maintain these systems, so that when you go to do these analysis, you have all the information available immediately. So some efficiencies on that end is in the systems as well. I think of the example from our ranch of pink eye. My husband, who would prefer not to do the computer work, his north, like things that he's good at, that he loves to do, are out in the field. And he was moving some hot fence this year, and he noticed there's one or two maybe eyes. Like, he couldn't tell for sure, but he just got a feeling that you need to go out there and ride through everything and see. And sure enough, like, there were going to be 2 or 3 bad eyes, and there could have been a few more. And so he ended up just kind of being really proactive about treating that, and averted, like a bad pink eye outbreak that we had suffered the year before when somebody else was moving the hot fence and kind of missed that first little signal that maybe you were headed for something you could have treated early, because they didn't have the same experience and eye for the land. And so I think one of the directions and values that we hold is that people should do the work that they are good at and that they love.
Yeah.
It's both.
Yeah, very good. Marissa, early on you mentioned getting organized, or that process. So did you ever enlist someone to help in that process, or was it just the process of getting ready to turn those things over that was kind of helpful?
So we had some part-time administrative help, like administrative assistant, that absolutely helped in the process and held me accountable and held our team accountable, like our family accountable, to provide the content or the records and the information necessary to fill out those systems.
Yeah. Do you think that the elements of those records, like the different records that are helpful to fill out those systems, will be unique to each operation, or are they fairly consistent? And so, as far as what are some of those things, I guess, could we be that specific, or do you think they're unique to each operation?
I think there's a lot of solutions to these same problems. Like, there are a lot of existing tools out there. But there are a lot of similarities in those tools. And so ranchers might go about solving this problem in their own, record keeping for treatment records. You can use any of the applications that are available, like subscription applications, or you can use a Google form, or you can use a Red Book, or we're all kind of writing down the same information, just using a different tool. So there are a lot of tools to answer these questions, but I see a lot of consistency in the types of information that we all need to be keeping to help us answer questions and then proactively plan on our operations.
Sure.
Just react.
Right. Yep. And so can you give me kind of a specific example? And I'm thinking here of kind of the challenges that are facing, or maybe unique to producers in the West, and a specific example of how this kind of has fleshed itself out over the course of the life of this business that you guys are getting off the ground here, as far as specific example of how you're serving those people in the West and some of the challenges that are maybe unique to them and that they're facing with regard to their on some level their ability to continue operating, I guess, would probably be a fair way to say it.
One of the projects that we have been working on recently is helping a group of ranchers to develop and then maintain some consistent monitoring, like land health monitoring on their ranches. And everyone is doing a great job on their ranches. But this helps kind of give a little bit of proof to that. So what's the proof that you're doing a good job? And this program will help that. And I think in the West, where we have a lot of public lands, that this helps give some consistent information across the land resource, and developing that monitoring, sort of a monitoring system and a protocol and a mapping system that helps show that is one example.
Sure.
I always think of I mean, I've seen the progression of Zach and Marissa and their family's ranch just, from just a few years ago. And like how maybe Zach was keeping his treatment records on his cattle back then compared to what it is now. And Marissa talks about it a lot. She hasn't mentioned it quite yet, but she will at some point. But it's a behavior change, right? And you create these habits. And she talked a little bit about accountability. And I remember like when they were first doing it, the process of Zach, if he had to doctor a yearling, was he took a picture of the ear tag with his phone, right? And he just sent that picture to their admin assistant. And then he might put a note on it, 5 cc's of Draxon or something on it. And she had he didn't have to write the ear tag number down or anything. Then she had her own spreadsheet of the input of that data so they could keep track of all the cattle that they doctored. To today, where they basically have an app that they can enter their own, like now Zach enters his own doctoring records in, but it was that support and that accountability that helped evolve that behavior to now it's a little bit more, it's like built in, its habit. So it's a progression of somebody that, didn't really, didn't keep track of those records early on to now keeping track of those records on to then now actually adopting technology at whatever level they were to then advancing that technology to the current thing. And I think that progression is important to recognize that sometimes we ask people to go from nothing, like from the bottom to the technology, and we don't bridge that gap and help change that behavior. And so therefore we blame the technology when it really wasn't the technology that failed us. It was actually the behavior and adopting the habit and having the accountability to get to that point. And so I think for me, we've seen that in monitoring as well, right? Like there's this point where ranchers it's always been done for them for the longest time, or you have to spend a lot of money to go do it, or you spend a lot of time to go do it, and ranchers blame that on the reason. So one of the things that we're really being intentional about right now is, and we do believe technology is going to change that. I really believe remote sensing and some of the ability for satellite imagery to tell us what's going on our ranches and landscape, and to see change over time with satellite images going over every 16 days across this whole earth. Like that's coming. It's here, but it's like a little bit inaccessible for the common person. But we go from not doing any monitoring to having somebody do some monitoring to now the satellite, and all the time the rancher wasn't involved in any of it. And so we're really passionate about bridging that gap so that as technology comes, ranchers have a better understanding of what that technology is actually going to be telling them, and they can have a higher level of literacy in this process. And
if I go, even on that treatment record example, like if we go back even before we had any admin support, we knew we had to keep track of animal treatments to fulfill our obligation for any of the contracts that we might be selling under for a value add program. And then we also knew we should be keeping track to try and understand, like, do we have a healthy herd or not a healthy herd? Because you kind of remember the outbreaks, but it's really easy to forget the foot rot here or there. And was it 10 or was it 50, or is it a big percentage of the herd or little? So we knew we had to keep track. And so it started off with a lot of times after we started a family, I wasn't necessarily out in the field during those, when cattle were getting treated. So I couldn't just write it down. So inevitably after kids were in bed, and I knew that they went out treating, that they had asked at night. And at that point in time, my husband's job as a cowboy was done, and he was home as a dad and a husband. And then I'm asking him about work again. And it just feels a lot like nagging to both of us, like to get this information out. And so incorporating somebody else in a professional role to ask and help get that information was one of the ways. That was the first behavior change for both of us. Is for me, to get the information in a professional way, and for him to give the information in a professional way, and getting somebody in between for us that really helped clear up some of that communication channels, because it all happened in business hours then instead of at night when I remembered. And then the next step is in that behavior change is taking a photo instead of writing it on a glove. And then the next step of that is sending the photo to somebody that is going to put that information into a spreadsheet. And then the next step of that behavior change for us was to get that then put directly into the spreadsheet, not to have anyone put it in, but be able to fill out an application that immediately puts it into a spreadsheet with timestamp and proves we've been actually treating these livestock when we say we've been treating them and how many. But those for us, none of the progressions in our management have happened from 0 to 100. There's a gradient in there. And that's the same with monitoring. If you want comprehensive monitoring across your ranch, and you as a practitioner want to know what that monitoring means, you can't go out and get 200 sites that took you 15 days to get, and you needed comprehensive knowledge of every plant that you saw. Like, you have to start where you are. And I think a lot of this journey for me is recognizing that sometimes that's just learning one grass, or sometimes that's going from writing your treatment record on your glove to taking a photo.
Yeah. And so I think, I've got listeners from 6 inches of annual precipitation to 60. That's not an exaggeration. So I think maybe to help maybe some of those closer to the 60 inches of annual precipitation understand the challenges that are present in the West, what role does monitoring play in kind of the sustainability of these operations in the West, and why is it such an important piece? And I think, James, you could probably speak to this as somebody who, was in the position you were in formerly as a manager.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that I would say 90% of ranches in the West actually rely on federal ground, whether that's a BLM permit, a forest permit, and oftentimes even some state lands intermixed or intermingled in there. And so these public land allotments, they have, certain land health requirements that are required of them, and then there's also a lot of eyes in that public land space, and a lot of other. I mean, it's multiple use spaces, so you've got wildlife habitat, you've got public enjoyment, recreation. There's certainly endangered species, all of this stuff, and so when you kind of bring that to the table for and every one of those ranches, relies on, like, if you took away that public land, these ranches wouldn't be able to survive. I mean, they don't have enough land base to be able to, or they'd be so small that that's not sustainable at that point. And so they rely on these federal grazing permits, which have a lot of scrutiny and have a lot of expectations and have a lot of eyes on them, whether intentionally or accidentally, they have eyes on them that are always placing judgment on your management. And they all sometimes have, differing opinions on what's good or what's not good. And so a lot of ranchers have kind of let the agencies kind of tell their story, right? And as capacity constraints have, been increased, the agencies haven't, quite frankly, went out there and done a good job of telling that story or tracking the condition of that land. And so it's imperative that the rancher at least do it or find a way to do it. And so I think that's, kind of to answer your question, that's why it's really important out here in the West, let alone some of the opportunities that I think are coming a rancher's way. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of, I think, opportunity in some of those ecosystem service projects that might be coming, that ranchers just need to have a better awareness of what is the condition of my land and how can I continue to improve that to maybe achieve some of these ecosystem service projects. So,
Marissa, have you seen that play out on your ranch, or do you guys have some of that federal land as well that you're dealing with, or the monitoring on that federal land? Is that something that you've been kind of had a front row seat to?
We have both BLM and Forest Service, and our Forest Service allotment has historically had groups that were really apprehensive about any kind of grazing on public land. And by having some independent monitoring and some self-monitoring and informed engagement, we've been able to transition that relationship, both with our Forest Service partners and the group that is concerned about public land grazing, into something that's really productive. And so that independent or that additional monitoring and ability to tell the story, what we're trying to do on the land, and that the idea of proving it really helped improve our relationship into something that's now it's taken it from conflict to collaboration. What
was the nature of the conflict? What were some of the specific concerns that other stakeholders had?
I mean, so any cattle that were either out of the prescribed allotment, like stray cattle, to just the whole idea of grazing on public land.
Right.
So that it's very technical components of prescribed grazing that's written in the plan for a calf that went back, or a cow that strayed an invisible boundary, to just the concept of it.
Well, and in public land as a whole, there's very little infrastructure, and usually water sources are, certainly places of congregation, and those water for everybody, for recreationalists and for, I would say more conservation or environmental groups. I mean, when you think about habitat, water's like the critical component to it. And when you think about livestock, water's the critical component to it. You can't have a grazing plan unless you have a water plan. And when you have a little ability to change that water plan, you don't just get to go put pipelines wherever you want. And you don't get to just, break up the ground into all these little paddocks. And, there isn't always those same tools available to you on public land to manage them well as there is on private ground. And so there is inherent challenges with this public land to manage it well. And so then there's these sensitive areas, these riparian corridors or riparian areas that tend to get a lot of focus and a lot of attention. And so it's a really hard thing to manage. And that, in my experience, like those are probably the primary areas of conflict is around water sources or, riparian areas. So,
yeah. There's nothing new under the sun. That's been the source of conflict for eons, right?
Yeah.
Wells, water. But, so Marissa, then that some of those people, we've talked about it before, up to and including range conservationists in the U.S. Forest Service would be antagonistic toward grazing. We've had that experience in my family. But what would you say were some of the things that you were able to monitor, capture, and communicate in a way that it sounds like made a difference in the relationship, maybe even changed some minds, because it wasn't a change in personnel that led to a better relationship, at least as the way I took it. It was more of a communicating what you guys were doing, and that facilitated that mind change in the individuals, whether they were private or public partners. Do I understand that right?
I'd say in our given family context, it's just contact and sharing information really, help facilitate a relationship. I think in the work that we are continuing to do in the West, some of the monitoring work that we're doing with Northway, that it's a combination of having consistent data across the landscape. So the same kind of measurement that you can repeat at the same location year to year, and the accountability to do that, and the systems to do that. And then probably the key part is that the land managers or the ranchers are participating in the monitoring, so that you can be on the ground observing how you'd like your management to be impacting that ground and reflecting on the changes that you see, whether it's going in the direction that you're hoping it is, or the experiment isn't working, or the water infiltration took a really long time, or it went really fast, or having rangers participate in that monitoring. And then the consistency of it is, I think the work that happened on our family ranch probably helped inform this, but we've taken the ability to do this in multiple places and with consistency and participation
right
here more recently.
I think there's a point to be made in some of this public land grazing. We kind of hear the story of like, if we just do a good job managing, we can double the carrying capacity of our ranch, right? Like so people are inspired to go out and do all of this stuff because they feel like economically it's going to, it'll be like buying another ranch, right? In the public land space, that isn't necessarily the goal, right? I think in a lot of ways, the goal is actually to retain that social license or that ability to continue to do that. And so you have to, I think it's critical nowadays. It's always been critical, right? But I think we're really trying to help bridge that gap of creating more rancher engagement in that monitoring, storytelling process in a really a way that the rancher is a participant in that rather than somebody else telling the story for them. Not so that they can double the carrying capacity of their ranch, but so that they can retain that social license and keep that part of their ranch. And I think that's the reality. Sometimes we don't get to double our carrying capacity by doing good things or making these extra investments that can sometimes they're justified by if you're on a private ranch and you do all this work and you can increase your animal units, and that's great. But that isn't always the case out here in the West. Sometimes it's just retaining what you do have that's your goal. So
right.
And I think of another conversation that James and I have had as we've developed this, and James says knowledge is power. And so whoever, has the knowledge a lot of times has the power. And so one of the ideas is monitoring is if you can have the knowledge about what's going on your land, you can have the power. And that's true with additional information about your land resource that might be available through a government agency, whether it's like the RAP information through the NRCS or the monitoring that the agencies have been doing on your permit for years and years. Sort of having access and retaining that information and the information about any other additional monitoring that you're doing and knowledge is power.
Yeah. Earlier, I kind of asked the question about what facilitated that improvement in the relationship, Marissa, and you said that it was communication. So, and now it sounds like the agencies have been doing a lot of this monitoring. And so are you communicating with them about that information in order to, as James said, maintain that social license to continue operating on that land? Is it just a matter of communicating with them about that information, or do you have to bring something to the table in that discussion? Or it's just, I think that sometimes this relationship is just adversarial, right? We want to avoid even having the conversations because we just don't want to engage in that deal. But you're saying the communication helped. Was there something specific that you were communicating, or was it just the opening that door and starting the conversation that helped that relationship?
Yeah. Well, in our case, it's not so much with the agency, although I don't think that that's the case. I think there are adversarial relationships with the agency or any additional stakeholder. It could be the same. For us, it was both. It's the opening of the door to have communication, but it's also having the content to open the door to show or to talk about. So there's a combination.
What is that content specifically? What content are you showing them? Is it monitoring data that you have collected yourself, or what is it specifically?
in our case of that's what it was, is monitoring data, but also the invitation to collect the monitoring data together in our specific case. But the work across the West and the work that we're doing, having consistent information in a consistent format.
I mean, I think for the longest time, ranchers have been accused of anecdotal information, right? It's been used to justify their social license, and then in the gaps, the agency might send a team out to collect some of their own data. And I actually think that collaborative monitoring is the best solution, because it's actually the rancher and the agency are collecting the data together. Now, all of a sudden, the rancher was a participant, right? So now it's more believable, rather than the agency go collect the data and come back and put it on the rancher's desk and say, this is what it said, right? Some of the best conversations in the world on anything. It's like a field day versus a webinar. What you get out of a field day with a bunch of people with their boots on the ground, or with a cow in the background, or with a dog along, or with your kids, playing in the ground all the while you're having the conversations, are way more constructive than. It doesn't mean that those webinars or podcasters don't have a place, but I would say for the last 30 or 40 years, the agencies got away for the sake of efficiency, right? They got away from going out with the rancher and looking and making those observations together. And I think that this is a new day, right? We're not the kings of this, right? I think this is happening more, and we're just trying to help empower and bridge some gaps, some literacy gaps, for one, because there's a difference between a rancher who's probably got a pretty good education in maybe ag business and animal science, and then he's going out with somebody that's got a master's in range ecology, right? Like that. So there's some there's a gap there that needs bridged, and we're working really hard to help bridge that gap. And it's not dummying it down. It's not dummying down the data or the relevance of the data, but it is creating some systems that are actually more understandable by the ranchers and appreciated by the agencies. So I think, because even the agencies, quite frankly, have got reams and reams of data that they don't use to make any decisions. And so we've really been more intentional about, hey, let's get rid of all the crap that nobody's actually using, and let's gather information that's meaningful to make some management decisions here. So that's one of the things that is important.
And for Ranching for Profit, I tell you, we should all be doing this anyways, because it's what informs our business, so we can make proactive choices, not reactive choices. But in the Ranching for Profit community to date is self-motivated. Some of these other influencing relationships that we're seeing are outside stakeholders requiring this accountability for social license to operate or opportunity to a market or to a land base.
Yeah. And again, back to kind of this same conversation we had earlier, but coming at it from a little bit different angle. Just in South Dakota alone, I know ranches that run cows on 9 animal unit days per acre, and I know ranches that run cows on 120 animal unit days per acre, just within the borders of South Dakota, 400 miles east to west. And I think that as you go west, you can get into less productive ground, a lot less productive ground than that, as you're in the shadow of the Rockies and some of that. So can you just kind of give a sense of the scale and what kind of makes this challenging in some regards, as far as that data collection is concerned? I would imagine that's part of the challenge of this, and why this relationship could use kind of some third-party help as far as just even the collection of that data.
Yeah, and I would say the data, I'll just go back to this. I think the data isn't, we think that the data out here on this landscape is telling us more than I believe it tells us, right? And this is why I think technology is going to advance it. For the longest time, we went out there and we've thrown some hula hoops on the ground, and we might get, if we're lucky, which isn't sustainable, we might get, 15 hula hoops on 1 million acres, right? And we somehow think that those 15 hula hoops are telling us what's going on that entire landscape. And we're fooling ourselves to think that that's actually what it's telling us. And so I think our team is really focused on being more intentional about where we place some of this monitoring so we can minimize, like, where are we really actually impacting the landscape with our management, and where are we wanting to improve it? And then let's monitor those locations. We call them management learning locations rather than like key points. And so I think we're really focused on that, and then really focused on the interaction of increasing rancher literacy and rancher and agency communication, because we think that, I really believe this is more of a social issue than it is an ecological issue. And so really focusing on creating an environment where everybody is working well together and learning well together, communicating, and then coming up with better solutions together while they're out there on the ground, because they're not so overwhelmed with the amount of data that they have to collect. And so they're more intentional about coming up with solutions when they're out there kind of observing, seeing things with their own eyes. There's nothing worse than to get a ream of monitoring sites put on your desk and saying, we've got a problem, right? And have never been in the field to see some of that stuff with your very own eyes. And knowing all the while that a lot of that data was collected by some maybe university interns from Vermont, right? That are now telling you what's going on your landscape and putting that into a report to a range specialist or whatever. And that's like, not to get derailed, but I really do believe that technology is going to help us get there to really understand I still remember when I was at the Wine Cup, we had 300 monitoring locations on 1 million acres, which was a lot and completely unsustainable to go out there and monitor those. Maybe you would get into a rotation where it was every 5 years. The truth is it didn't happen. But we had this data, and it was piecemeal data across the entire landscape that was very heterogeneous, a lot of variation. In elevation and precip and plant species, soil composition, all of that stuff. 318, that seems like a lot, 318 sites for one ranch. When we ended up getting some work done by Open Range Consulting, where they came out and did some remote sensing work, it was like and they created the maps for me that really kind of describe some of the major things that I needed to understand that were going on. Where did we have some invasive annual grasses? Like, where were those concentrated areas? Map out where the junipers were encroaching into our sagebrush, high desert steppe. Where were we lacking understory in where were we lacking the bunch grass understory in our sagebrush? Like, they could map that. It was like somebody gave me the box to the puzzle, right? Like, you've seen all the pieces. Like, can you imagine putting together a puzzle with all these pieces, but not really knowing what it's supposed to look like? It would be, an extremely big challenge. And so this is why I'm a big proponent of remote sensing, because I think it actually puts it's a visual aid for us to kind of see our landscape in whole. And now we can go out into these specific places and make these observations where we have concerns, like really get focused on that time that we spend, because the truth is we don't have enough time to go to all these places on this landscape. Because we're working, in the West, it's a lot of scale that we're talking about. And I think in scale, when somebody says, hey, let's go do this, I think, can that scale? Because if it can't scale in the West, it's probably a no-go, right? It's probably not going to be sustainable. Maybe somebody's got the money to keep that going, or maybe somebody's got the energy, but that energy is going to wane. So I really think it's more about the social side of this thing and getting people out there, building relationships, building conversation, building literacy together, and coming up with solutions when they're out there. So I don't know, maybe that was a total miss of your question, but it's kind of where my head's at.
No, I liked it. It was good. I appreciate that. And I think that what role then specifically is Northway playing as far as you mentioned getting agency representatives and ranchers out there together in the monitoring process. Is your role then to help them select those monitoring areas, or what role are you guys playing?
I think one way we've really been working hard at trying to come up with a methodology that makes sense for rancher and agency engagement. So it's still relevant and rigorous from a scientific standpoint, but it's engaging for the rancher. So like creating a methodology for that. And then I do think as a whole, I really do believe the West is, I see a change in the agency and the culture to want to be more participatory with the rancher and go do this stuff. I mean, I think they're under the same capacity constraints that ranchers are. We don't have enough time. And so finding a methodology that's got some efficiency to it is also helpful. And so we've been like, we're kind of sitting in that interim space and kind of playing around in just a few little niches that I think is scalable and can be replicable across a lot more of the West than where we're even playing right now. But we aren't necessarily going out and trying to solicit, opportunities to do that. We just see a need and maybe an interest by the rancher to try to do a better job, to tell their story better, to maintain that social license, and then the desire from the agency to want to do that as well, because they don't really have a solution within the regulations or the acceptable monitoring protocols right now. So coming in and help facilitate that conversation and bring people together, kind of a little bit of self-discovery. And then where those sites are selected, like we would try to guide that conversation a little bit, but it really comes down to, we really believe that this is kind of a bottom up instead of a top down approach. So where's the rancher really interested, right? Like, let them select those sites, because if they're not really interested in that place and it's some random site that's out there on the ranch or out on some land, like, their engagement wanes really quick. But if they're curious about a place and they're interested in it, then that goes a long ways with getting them to maintain, annual observations and regular visits, every 4 or 5 years to more intense, monitoring of a location. And typically an agency, if they see a rancher hungry to go out there and do that, we haven't seen it where they're like, no, we're not like they're looking for that. So.
Yep. Yeah. And we've been on both sides of that. My family has been on both sides of that with, I think, agency personnel that would prefer not to see cows on public land, and now probably more like kind of the illusion the situation you alluded to of agency personnel that are welcoming, and really actually even we've seen some permits that went offline. And my family's been part of bringing one of them back online. Yep. It was there. It had been vacant for years, and now there's cows there again. And so, I think that would maybe be indicative, or at least an anecdotal evidence of kind of what you're talking about. What or both of you maybe can speak to this, but what has facilitated that transition within the agency? Do you have any sense of what's going on there?
Well, I don't know. I do think that, and this is what I would promote, like ranchers really trying to have a better job, or doing a better job of describing how livestock can be used as a tool rather than just a consumer, being consumptive. Like, we just need the grass, right? Like, and so I think there's a mindset. So I would suspect in most of these situations, these case studies are anecdotal situations where we have a very progressive rancher that's learned how to manage his private ground pretty well, use cows as a tool to regenerate or restore or maintain habitat, being able to then go, like, people see that, right? And you get a reputation for that. You got some credentials, you get some credibility. You got a language now to talk about how animals are a tool. And then I think that, I would say in my situation in the West, fires have really plagued the West. And so now you have all this grass that's just out there ready to burn, right? And I think people are hungry for solutions, like, how can we keep these? Not that fire in itself is a problem. It's these catastrophic mega fires that are a problem. And it's because there's, in a lot of cases now, and it's usually followed by years of good precip and blah, 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 or 2 years after a good precip, you got all this residual dry matter that's left behind. And I think people, agencies included, are looking for solutions. I think the public's, quite frankly, looking for solutions. Goats grazing around homeowners association or, communities to try to get some of that vegetation down. So I think if a rancher has a good vocabulary, has good control, has good relationship, has credibility because they've done it.
And accountability.
Yeah. That now all of a sudden the agencies are saying, hey, I'll take a risk on that guy going out here and helping me manage this public land better. And so we'll reissue this permit that maybe has been vacant. So I think I see that happening. I mean, there's a lot of, that isn't the only thing that's happening. Every relationship and every situation is a little bit different, but I think that's some of the things that I'm seeing. But it's not just happening with anybody, right? It's happening with a rancher that can talk the talk, right? And walk the walk. He's got proof on his private ground that he's done a really good job on it. And I always said when, even when I was at the Wine Cup, like, we got to manage our private ground well before we're ever going to be giving any chance to run the public ground well. So, you got to take care of your house, right? Before you're going to get something else.
Yep. Marissa, is that kind of one of the roles of Northway is the accountability piece, bringing the accountability to that relationship and helping the rancher be accountable to collect and organize that data? Yeah,
I'm not sure that that's what I saw happening or what my vision for what would happen, but as we reflect and look at some of the really important pieces of this, it's accountability, and holding the space for either those conversations or the follow through on whether it is bookkeeping or monitoring or records inventory management.
Yep. And I think that we've mentioned a couple of times, the issue with those reams of data that we get that really don't get used or just really aren't usable. And so can you talk to me a little bit about kind of some of the services that you guys are providing as far as getting that data into the hands of relevant personnel, whether they're private landowners, ranchers, agency personnel, in a way that's useful and some of that?
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the things that kind of came out of our work too, was, with our mapping services, is being able to take, ranchers tend to be visual, right? Like, just looking at spreadsheets isn't, quite frankly, all that exciting for most of them. But if you can take that and put it on their ranch and help them visualize where it's at. And so just and then get excited when I say that, but doing that it also in a relevant way for the agencies, right? In a format that they understand, because most of them are very visual as well. They got into land management, whether with an agency, because they like maps, they like places, they like to navigate around. And they're used to, but we haven't done a good job of that, I think, over the last, few decades. And so, being able to take and put that information on a map for them, and then being able to kind of move around within that map and interact with that data kind of real time with photos automatically populating themselves, so you can kind of see the picture and the data and the place all in one spot. And so we've really developed some really interactive mapping tools to be able to help that work for ranchers and public agencies, so that they can kind of have good conversations when they get out of the field and back to the office, right? Because there is some decisions that have to be made once they get out of the field that they didn't make. They discussed, but they didn't actually make them. And so having this place of reference and well organized, and taking some of the human error out of it, and the technology exists now. And so we've really tapped into that as a service that we're providing now.
And it also puts the knowledge in one location.
Yeah.
Like, you can start storing the historical knowledge of your land asset, from specific monitoring to the location of a head gate or an irrigation ditch, on a map that's can accumulate information or store that data and then share it.
Yeah.
The combination.
Sounds very good. I really appreciate you guys' time today. Do you have any other major nuggets that you were hoping to cover? I mean, we're obviously touching the surface of these issues and kind of the services that you guys provide, but anything else that was on your mind as far as this conversation is concerned?
There's lots on our mind, right? I think for me, Marissa, I tend to align a little bit mission-minded, right? We really want to see family ranches be successful. And I think there's a lot of opportunities out there, even for young families that want to get into ranching that maybe didn't have a ranch or maybe want to go create their own space. And so I think for us, that's in the forefront of our mind all the time. Like, how do we help support, find opportunities, create systems, provide accountability that's going to be necessary for, this world that we're living in. And then all the while knowing that, we're in a low margin business. Like, agriculture isn't the place you're going to go make a ton of money. Like, nobody's, necessarily doing that. But we think there's a healthy living there, a good quality of life and healthy economic returns that can be done with it if it's done well. And I think at the end of the day, like, that's what wakes us up every morning, is just, trying to support this industry based on the experiences that we've had and a gap in services that's just not really there, and then kind of bringing it all together. So I don't know. I'll leave the last word to Marissa. She probably does a better job.
I think that's a good wrap up.
All right. So show notes page for today would be workingcows.net/262, workingcows.net/262. Any other links that I should throw up there other than northwayrs.com?
I don't think
that pretty much cover it.
We're pretty simple.
Yeah, good.
So
that's a good way to be.
We're not on social media or any of that stuff.
That's a good way to be. Yeah. Don't need more than one call to action. You just muddy the waters, I guess. So if we're talking about riparian areas, we don't want to muddy the waters, right?
That's right.
Well, thank you guys for your time today.
All right. Thanks, Clay.
Very good stuff. Very much enjoyed that. Very much appreciate their perspectives, and very much look forward to seeing just how their business is impacting ranchers, as far as I said in the intro, freeing them up to do what they're best at, what they enjoy the most, and those kinds of things. So looking forward to next week. Going to be talking to Zach Smith and Jason Mock, both. Talking to them about stock cropper and kind of the future and where they see this going, and they're really, getting close to bringing this to market and seeing kind of wide scale distribution of it, hopefully adoption of it. I think it's a very powerful tool, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how they continue to bring it out into the public square. And so look forward to that conversation with them coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows Podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.